I would like to welcome everyone to today's technical conference on the Solutions Development and Selection in the Coordinated Grid Planning Process, or the CGPP as we call it. As a reminder, today's technical conference is the last in the series of, I believe, 5 or so technical conferences that we have held on the Coordinated Grid Planning Process. Shortly, we'll hear a presentation, I believe, by Jeff Marr from National Grid on the joint utilities ideas with respect to solutions development and selection in the grid planning process. And as I've said previously at these CGPP tech conferences, the intent here is to solicit ideas and input from stakeholders. So I encourage any and all to actively participate today. Jump in with questions, comments, suggestions. I believe we'll be using the chat feature for those questions or comments. We may also open up the phones for those who are not on the WebEx and would like to chime in. And Liz and Jaleel, you can correct me if I'm wrong with respect to the logistics. So with that, thanks again to the stakeholders for your anticipated participation today. And thank you to the joint utilities for preparing the presentation materials today. And I'll turn it back to you, Liz.
Great, thank you, Tammy. I do want to make one slight recommendation. We thought with this topic that it might be appropriate to take a little different approach, and if people have questions, please raise your hand so we and the presenters know that there are questions out there, and the presenter will take time as he goes along to respond to as many of those as he can, and then of course we will have time at the end for any follow-up or additional questions. So so just please use the raise hand feature so we can keep track of who has a question. And with that, Jeff, are you ready to start?
Yes. Can you hear me, and can you see a presentation on your screen?
Both coming in.
All right, excellent. Again, welcome everyone. My name is Jeff Marr. I work in National Grid's Transmission Planning Group, and for quite a while now, I've been engaged with all of the other utilities in developing the coordinated grid planning process. So today, we're going to talk about a portion of the process that's being proposed, and that's the solution development and selection. So briefly for our agenda today, we're talk about a little bit about the context, a brief overview of CGPP, kind of as a reminder of some of the other tech conferences that we've had. And then we're going to move into an overview of the solution development process. And there's several steps here that include the solution development process. We'll talk about them all together at a very high level, and then we'll move into each individual piece in more detail. And then we'll kind of conclude our discussion today to talk about what comes after the process is complete. So again, the context here, CGPP remains in development. We do not have a final plan, and what we're going to present today represents the utilities plans and thinking as of today. It's not final. So again, we will focus on the solution development and selection process, and a comment period on the entirety of the CGPP remains open, with the goal that the utilities are planning to submit the revised plan for CGPP on January 1st, 2023. So we see this as a valuable opportunity to gather stakeholder input and feedback, and we welcome that throughout the discussion today. Let's briefly recap what CGPP is. The coordinated grid planning process is meant to identify the expansion of the transmission and distribution systems to help unlock renewable capacity and energy. Right? The goal is to identify projects that are necessary to help the state meet their clean energy goals. The CGPP is essentially serving as an integrated resource planning process. So over here on the right-hand side, we have kind of the very high-level overview of what the process looks like. We start with capacity expansion and scenario development, right? There's a lot of pathways that can get us to the state's goals. So we try to develop the scenarios for what that will look like. Once we have those scenarios, we move into database development. Primarily what that means is power flow databases, but there are a lot of extra pieces, auxiliary pieces that go along with power flow. So the database would help us pull all those pieces together that we'll need in order to study the system. And that's what we will do next. We'll move into a local assessment. So understanding where the bottlenecks are, where the limitations are, where the system, the transmission and distribution systems may be a barrier to meeting the state goals. And then a review of solutions. So that's, again, what we're going to talk about here today. And you'll see that there's kind of several steps here with the review of solutions, and then a least cost planning assessment, right? And that's to make sure that the solutions being proposed are the least cost way to achieve the state's goal. So that at a very high level is what CGPP is expected to look like. Is there a question? Should I take questions now?
Yeah, if there's a question and you've got, it's a good opportunity to respond. Yeah, I think it's from Rodika Donaldson. What was your question?
Hey everyone, thank you for putting this presentation and technical conference together for us. I have a question on the solutions. Is there a part of the process where other solutions from other stakeholders could be proposed?
I think the presenter is going to get to that.
Yep. Yeah, we will talk more about that. So if your question remains, maybe we can pick that up later.
Okay. Thank you.
So the schedule is subject to change, but here's kind of a high-level overview of what we expect the timeline to look like for CGPP. So year one is really focused on data collection and developing those build-out scenarios, moving into stage two, which is the database development, and then starting the local assessments to identify those needs. And then what we're really going to focus on here today is year two. So year two is continuing those local assessments to identify the necessary solutions or necessary upgrades, review of the preferred solutions. Again, we'll talk about several kind of screenings that we're going to do on solutions, and then the least cost planning assessment followed by a report. So again, we're going to kind of focus here on year two during our discussion today. So what is it at the highest level? At the very highest level, the solution development process will look like a couple of distinct steps. So initially, solution development, again, using coordinated power flow cases, each utility will identify beneficial projects. That's the first step. Utilities will identify potential projects. Once those projects are, potential projects are identified, again, we'll be using power flow models. We'll update those models to include our projects. And what we're doing in this initial screening is we're looking for either project overlap or negative interaction of projects at the local level. And again, we'll talk quite a bit more about each one of these steps on the following slides. Once we've completed that step two, that screening of the local level, we'll move into a screening of the bulk level. And what we'll do here is screen for negative impacts to the bulk system and also search for whether a regional transmission solution could satisfy the identified needs. The conclusion of these kind of first three numbered bullets is a portfolio of projects. And what we'll do with that portfolio of projects is complete a least cost planning assessment to identify and rank the projects necessary to achieve the state mandates. And again, we'll get into more details on each one of these steps. This is at a very high level how the process will flow. So where do we start? We will start with the scenarios and power flow databases that I mentioned would be developed in the previous CGPP stages. So using those tools, we'll apply local, regional, and national planning standards to identify the limitations on the local system's ability to support the CLCPA targets. So where are those pinch points? Where are those limitations? What will prevent the state from achieving the goals? We need to identify those areas and those needs. Once we've identified those needs, the intent would be to look at all options that could potentially address those. And the goal is to identify the most cost-effective upgrades. Now, some examples of things that are on the table for consideration. This is not an exhaustive list, but local T&D infrastructure, bulk transmission, non-wires solutions, energy storage, grid enhancing technology, especially those technologies that would be identified by the Advanced Technology Working Group, and hybrid approaches. So if we can mix and match local and bulk, or bulk and energy storage, or any combination of these solutions, we would be looking for those combinations or those unique projects to help drive, again, those cost-effective upgrades. Now, what we'll do is identify those solutions individually by each utility, and we're really focusing on the needs of the CLCPA. So kind of the first two needs, and we'll talk a bit more about some other needs on the next slide. The first two are kind of unique to CLCPA. So the first one here is the ability to address the need, right? That seems obvious. You have to be able to address the need, but also consideration of the amount of additional capacity or headroom created. So some of you have probably seen the utilities have been working recently to file headroom calculations, right? To give people an understanding of what we would kind of view as good or bad locations, or less desirable locations for generation to connect. And when we put a transmission project in place, it'll change headroom. So really understanding how a project creates or facilitates headroom, that's one of the first considerations of a solutions evaluation. Also a bit unique to CLCPA is commonality of solutions across scenarios. So within CGPP, we'll be looking at potentially multiple different scenarios or multiple different pathways to achieve the state's goals. So what will 2030 or 2035 or even 2040 look like? There's a lot of pathways to get us to those goals. And when we look across multiple scenarios, are there solutions that would help facilitate or be flexible across different scenarios? So that's a bit of a unique consideration here in CGPP. Now, of course, solution development would also consider things that are often considered in other planning efforts. So cost, right? We're considering cost. We're targeting a plus 50, minus 25% estimate accuracy to kind of put all of the projects on a similar footing when we think about cost. Constructability is a very big bucket. It can include things, in my mind, it includes things like property rights, environmental impact, permitting, and especially outages, right? What will we have to do in order to construct the project? Schedule, ability to meet the required in-service date, whether you're targeting, for example, a 2030 or a 2040 project to facilitate the state's goals. Schedule will be very important. Operability, all things being equal, if there's a solution that would provide more flexibility in terms of like system operation, for example, that would be an important consideration. Expandability. To me, expandability could mean multiple things, but to kind of give two examples, maybe it's physical expandability. So is there spare breaker positions at a new station, for example, which would allow that station to be expanded to include new lines or new connections? That's one example of expandability. Another example of expandability might be that a particular project lays the groundwork for other projects, right? So it's maybe the first step in expanding headroom within a region, and it can be built on to really grow out that area's transmission system. Impacts on customer reliability and resiliency, right? Very important today, and becoming even more important with the reliance on the electric system for heating, transportation, and everyday customer use. So these are very important considerations. And then synergies or impacts with other process. So whether that be the utility's internal process, or whether that's like a bulk transmission planning process from the NISO's perspective, where we want to make sure or evaluate whether these projects have impacts or synergies with any of these other planning efforts. So that at a very high level is how we will develop the initial list of projects that we would consider to address the needs. So next we're going to move into some screening, but I'd like to pause here, I think, take some questions about this initial step.
Thanks, Jeff. Do we have any questions for Jeff so far?
Hey, Liz, it's Kevin Lang. I think I have my hand up, but I'm not sure.
Now you do, Kevin.
Okay, thanks. Hey Jeff, it's Kevin Lang for the city. Just not on this slide, but on the previous slide at the bottom, it talked about, thanks, in the last bullet, developing solutions individually by utility. Given what we're looking at in some of the projects, the CLCPA projects, there's a potential that a project is going to be able to serve multiple utilities, or it might be located in one area but serve customers in other areas. How do you capture the projects that might be needed that would cross a utility service territory? I mean, similar to what you guys have done in the bulk level, the NISO kind of looks across the state, and even recently the projects that were sort of jointly proposed by NICEAG and National Grid on the bulk level, their phase 2 projects. I get here this is local transmission and distribution, but just given how the service territories are, I would think there's going to be some opportunities to develop synergies. Not the synergies you just mentioned on the next slide, but can you talk for a minute on how you will capture those inter-utility synergies?
Yep. So there will be a piece of this that occurs in the next step. So I'll set that aside for a minute and only say that in the next step, we will be looking for those projects that may have overlap. But I'll also say here, as part of this effort, to try to go back to some of our experience with some of the work that the utilities have already done. For example, National Grid and Avangrid, we do have a lot of areas where our service territories, kind of dovetail with each other, maybe almost overlap. And what we kind of did in those areas is we were each independently studying the system, but if it was a primarily NICEAG area or Avangrid area, National Grid would let them take the lead. Or if it was primarily a National Grid area, we would take the lead. And then we would be communicating throughout the process about the needs and about potential options. So if they understood a little bit more about their system, and in this area they thought that they may have a more cost-effective upgrade, they would be discussing that with us, and we would be working together to identify those potential options. So it's really about a coordination between the utilities, using the same power flow databases, doing the same studies, and kind of working in lockstep to identify those needs and solutions. And again, we'll hit on kind of another step of coordination here in the next stage.
So it sounds like that coordination is going to be both somewhat informal and then at that later step a little bit more formalized. Is that fair?
Yes, that's great.
Okay.
Hey, this is Mike Mager. I have two questions.
Sure.
My first one deals with the scenarios you're using, and maybe this was addressed in a prior presentation, but to what extent are those being updated over time, and is there coordination with like the NISO planning processes? Like the NISO's finishing up a study that relies on a whole bunch of scenarios going out 2021 to 2040. To what extent are the scenarios that the joint utilities are using are different, and how will they be updated over time?
I think for a more in-depth answer, I think one of the previous tech conferences, I think they were recorded, really touched more on this. To try to briefly answer your question, we view the CGPP to be a 2-year cycle. It's not a one and done, so we'll be doing it every 2 years. And at the beginning of the process, we'll be doing data collection. So whether that's NISO studies, NISO forecasts, NYSERDA information, we'll be collecting all of the relevant information out there to feed into our scenario development. Would we be using the exact same assumptions, for example, as NYSERDA or the Climate Action Council, or NISO? Not necessarily. We may make some adjustments. Maybe we think it's a more appropriate assumption, or maybe there's new information that would push us in another direction. But we'll gather that data for every cycle and update all of our models and look for those pathways to achieve the 2030, 35, 2040, 2050 goals. So yeah, we'll be doing that every cycle.
And just a quick follow-up on that one, and the adjustments you make or the final scenarios you rely upon will be transparent and located somewhere that can be viewed?
Yeah, all of this, and again, I think for a more detailed answer, there was some tech conferences on this, especially the EPAC, which is our stakeholder-led forum, where all of those decisions and advisor, or all of those decisions will be made at that EPAC level that feed into those scenarios. So yeah, stakeholder-driven.
Thank you. And then my second question is you talked about the cost estimates being plus 50%, minus 25%. Obviously, that's a enormous range, especially dealing with projects of significant cost. At what point in the process do you envision refining those estimates?
You know, it's the estimates are a tough piece of this puzzle that we've been working on. The more time we have, the better the estimates get. But given our very compressed timeline, we'll be essentially sprinting to get those estimate accuracies. So that's what we envision filing the final report. We'll be using the estimates of that kind of accuracy range. And then I think for like example, some of the phase one projects, at least for National Grid, we are providing updates. So you would be able to see how those project estimates may change as we refine our engineering through project development.
Okay, well, and maybe this is just a comment then for staff purposes then, but I think it's really exposing customers to potentially very high costs to make decisions based on a plus 50%, minus 25% cost estimate.
Yeah, I hear your point, Mike. What we've said, what the commission has said so far is that cost estimates should be rate case quality. But exactly what that means, not exactly sure what that means. We certainly see estimates in this kind of a range. But no, I note your comment.
And this is Erin Hogan with Utility Intervention Unit. Just to follow up on Mike's point, understood, estimates are tough, but I think when it comes down to the BCA, using the BCA as if the estimate is the decision point, we should take a look at the BCA, recognizing the estimate can be plus 50%, minus 25%, and that can inform whether or not it's in the best interest for the people.
Okay, anything else?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Okay. You should put your hands down. There you go. It's only taken us, what, 5 or 6 of these conferences for everybody to get the hands up, hands down. Jeff, you want to continue?
Yep. All right, so here we have kind of the first of our two-step screening process. So the purpose of this step is to optimize across the portfolio, and we're looking for economies or we're looking for unintended impacts. So what we'll do is we're going to build on the collaboration I mentioned that occurred up to this point. So as Kevin characterized that, maybe a little bit less formal. So while we were coordinating, we developed all of our projects, and here we are. We're going to take all of our projects that were individually identified in each of the generation pockets or each region of the state, and we're going to put them into a new power flow case. And we're going to do 2 screenings. The first screening is a negative interaction screen. And here we're looking to see if the proposed solutions will have any potential interactions or conflicts, right? So if, maybe 2 utilities are both proposing to use use an existing 345 kV line as a supply or an on-ramp into the area. And maybe even though those projects are geographically separated by a large number of miles, maybe there's the potential that because both utilities are trying to use the same transmission line, it would have a negative impact. I'm sure there's a million other examples, but that's essentially what we're doing is we're looking to see is that when we put these projects all together, are there anything that could go wrong, anything that could potentially interact or have an adverse impact. We'll also be using or doing kind of the other piece that Kevin asked about. So they were both great questions, lead right into this. We're going to be looking to identify any potential to combine projects into more cost-effective solutions. So again, maybe to use the example I had just a minute ago where two utilities were both trying to build an on-ramp from the local system. Well, maybe it's not geographically that different. Maybe we can combine those projects from two on-ramps into just one on-ramp and help facilitate both of those generation pockets. That's just one potential option or just one potential example of where projects that may be in a kind of a similar area could be combined to create a more cost-effective solution. So these are the two first screenings that we'll do, and they focus more on the local level. Any questions about this screening?
Not seeing any.
Okay, so once we've completed this initial screen and made any modifications to any projects that were necessary, maybe we removed some projects, again, combined some projects, modified some projects, we move into a second screening. And this second screening is more focused on the bulk system. So continuing from the previous step, this step expands the review of the proposed solutions to assess the impact on the bulk system. Again, we're using power flow analysis and we're combining all of the proposed projects into these power flow databases. And we expect here, especially with this step, while we may use consultants in other portions of the CGPP, we especially expect to use consultants here to help minimize the impact on the overall schedule, because we do view that this step may be quite time consuming. So using consultants, we're going to first do a no harm test, and this is to confirm that the inclusion of all of the projects does not have any adverse impact on the bulk system. Now, this step is not meant to replace any of the NISO process, right? This is just to help us screen projects to make sure that there are no fatal flaws, for example, no deal breakers that would prevent that project from being viable. Next, we would look for bulk alternatives. And here the goal is to evaluate whether a regional transmission solution could satisfy the identified needs across multiple generation pockets, utility systems, or regions more efficiently or cost effectively than the local solution. So there are questions here about these two screenings we would do on the bulk system level.
I'm seeing Aaron. Yep.
Yeah, and so apologies, but I'm just trying to understand timeline in terms of the window in time you're evaluating and what happens in reality. So I guess let me just pose two options that probably will be the most concise way to ask this question. In a perfect world, you folks would update a power flow for each and every year to reflect the incremental change of the new units coming online. While we have a snapshot of goals set, like the 2030, 2040, everything will be happening incrementally. You're doing this study every 2 years. And so what I'm trying to understand is the judgment calls of what units are there, how do you, the question is do you do this analysis for every year incremental step, or do you just every 2 years look out to 2030 or a 10-year look ahead? Because the reality is, depending on how you do that, the answers could be different.
Yes. Yep. Good question. So as part of our database development, what we're proposing to do, right? So again, remember, we develop our scenarios and then we develop our databases that would use to do these studies. So in the databases that we're developing, what we're proposing to do is focus on the CLCPA goal years. So we intend to build cases that reflect at least 2030, 2035, and 2040. So we'll be focusing mostly on those goal years when we do our power flow studies.
Remember, it's Liz, just, Aaron, in response to your question, remember the statutory mandate that we are trying to implement is to plan for grid upgrades needed to support the CLCPA targets specifically.
Understood. And those investments are supposed to meet the BCA standard. And I'm just thinking through this a little bit, and I understand the screening process, but those snapshots in time and the sequencing of people and maybe people not building in the long run, or ultimately where the risks are. So I don't have an answer. It's just, those are some of my observations. I understood it because it's incredibly complex what you're doing. Doing it for every year obviously is not plausible, but I'm not entirely sure just if we're in 2022 and this whole process will be starting in 2024, or we're going to be in year 2 in 2023. I forget how those go, but I'm just wondering if it would be wise to maybe take a look, and similar to, quite honestly, somewhat of what the New York ISO does with their system resource outlook study, that, the first 4 years of the reliability study, the first 4 years, it is not such a focus, but focus on the year 5 and 10. And that just can give you an incremental step function of what is being built within a certain amount of time frame. But anyways, thank you. I'll put my hand down now.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Kevin.
Thanks. I think Chris Marlett was before me, though.
Oh, sorry, Chris. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Liz, and thank you, Kevin. Just 2 questions. Jeff, you mentioned that there's a number of areas where there's overlap between the utilities. How, and the fact that maybe one utility would take the lead over the other, how will that be delineated? And then secondly, how will it be communicated to other market participants so they're aware of it? And then the second question kind of, I think, goes to Aaron's point on, like, what time periods are you looking at? And you mentioned CLCPA. And my question is, then what are the assumptions that you're using for construction time periods for getting different projects done? So, for example, if this starts in 2024, are you assuming a 3 or 4 year construction period or something longer? There has to be some type of general, I think, assumption.
Yeah, let me tackle the second question first. So this is an area that utilities are very focused on, and it kind of ties back to, maybe I'll just flip back real briefly to this slide here. When we think about our options, right? You can accelerate the schedule, but that comes at a cost. You can address some of the constructability issues like property rights or permitting challenges, but that may add time. So we're trying to look across the need and identify the solutions that are most cost effective and can be delivered on time. And sometimes those projects are easy. Sometimes there are small changes that we can do to our systems that can boost a rating, or we build one station and can tie some existing lines together, and that can be done kind of under an expedited project. But then there are other times where projects will be long in development, and they could be, 5 to 8 years to bring us from this kind of concept stage to a completed project in the field. So we are aware that every project will unfortunately have to follow probably a different schedule. So if a project, for example, could not meet the schedule, maybe it's not a viable project. Or, or as we stage these projects across time, we would be considering, okay, this set of projects could be done for 2029, but these other projects wouldn't be in service until 2034. So the impact on whether or not those projects would help facilitate the goal would be something we would consider as we develop them. I think I had your first question, but you're going to have to remind me. I want to make sure I get it right.
Yeah, the first question, Jeff, was just the fact that you have so many different territories that overlap between joint utilities. How will that be communicated as to who is the lead in certain areas? Because that could be important to certain market participants.
I think I'll pull on our experience with our area of concern filing, where National Grid and Avangrid work together. And I think when you look in the report, it's really summarized by region. And then within each region, the identified projects or the projects necessary were identified. And, for example, in National Grid's Northern New York assessment, we had explicitly included some Avangrid proposed projects. They worked with us, they developed those projects, they put together the relevant information about those projects, and then they were folded into the overall report that just addressed the area. I think the projects were identified as Avangrid and not National Grid, and I think that's how we would propose to do it going forward is just within the report, the project, for lack of a better term, project owner would be identified in the final report.
Chris, it's Liz, and I may not be quite understanding your question, but certainly comments on, transparency and how information should be presented and what information should be presented are, all welcome. If I'm hearing you correctly.
Okay, thanks, Liz.
Yep. Anybody else right now, or should we continue?
Yeah, Liz, it's Kevin. I still had a question.
Oh, right, Kevin, sorry.
That's okay. Jeff, just on the screen that's up right now. So let's say in the second part of the analysis, you look at the bulk system, and I'm actually looking at the second part on the alternative screen, not the no harm. So let's say you've identified something, you look at the bulk alternatives, and that you find on a total basis with all the factors you just talked again with Chris, you find that there are merits to the local solution, there are merits to the bulk solution. Cost-wise, let's just say for my hypothetical, they're generally comparable. How would you pick? So at the end of the analysis, we'll each have attributes and each have some concerns. They sort of balance out so that the two projects are comparable. How would you then decide whether to go forward with a bulk solution versus a local solution? And the reason I ask this, just so you know, is it kind of seems as we're building out that there's a little bit of a blurring between that. Some of these projects are being built based on what is the appropriate location, whether it connects into a bulk system, whether it connects into a local system. So I anticipate we're going to see situations where there could be, particularly with the 115 versus say a 345, you might have either kind of solution being an acceptable solution.
Yeah, I understand your question. I think you put me in a hard scenario. I mean, all things being equal, which would we pick? That's a hard decision to make. And because initially I would say, well, is just the cost equal? Are the headroom benefits equal? Are they really truly equal across all of the scenarios?
Right.
There has to be some sort of distinguishing factor that would help us make that decision.
Okay.
if they were truly equal on every single footing, I don't know. I don't know exactly how we would decide, to be honest.
Just kind of thinking ahead, that's all.
Kevin, it's Liz, if I could add, this is a point that, you know, we're kind of focused on too, and what we're hoping the process gives the commission at this stage, you know, is some understanding of whether there might be reason to prefer a bulk solution or a combined bulk and local solution, and so we would like there to be some way to check on you know, we think this screen would be helpful, and we would like the commission to know whether bulk solutions are of interest. We don't expect the TOs to pick, so I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, no, Liz, I agree. It's a helpful screen. I don't see any problems with it. I was just curious what happens if as a result of the screen, they look, and I get what Jeff is saying, is there's probably not exactly the same, but if they're generally comparable, I was just curious whether there would be any preference for a bulk solution over a local solution or a local solution over a bulk solution.
Yeah, I would say that there's no preference. We're looking for the best project, and whether that's the project that comes in at the lowest cost or comes in with the greatest long-term benefits, that's the project that we would recommend. There is no preference over, you know, a particular type of solution. All things being equal, that's a tough call. We probably have to make that as we evaluate all of the different considerations for each of those potential options.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
But Kevin, this is Rick Schuler. I think this gets at the non-energy benefits that are not quantified in the overall BCA analysis.
Rick, you mean just to look at the totality of the potential benefits of each project to see if that tips the scales?
Yeah, I definitely think that would be a consideration.
Okay. Gotcha.
I mean, certainly we are considering more than just qualitative things. There are quantitative things. We are thinking of qualitative things. You know, for example, again, going back to operational flexibility or expandability. I mean, these are things that wouldn't necessarily show up in a calculation, but are things we would certainly be considering when trying to decide which project is a recommended alternative.
Thanks. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I'm all set for now.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Jeff.
Hey, Liz.
Okay.
It's Glenn here. I had one follow-up to Kevin's question. If I could.
Yeah, sure, Glenn.
Glenn from NIPA. Hi. So, hey, Jeff. My question is I had kind of assumed that if a bulk solution was found to be the preferred approach, then that would either have to be pursued as a PPTN or could be a PTP, Priority Transmission Project, but that it would then go into that process. And I just wanted to ask, am I right in that assumption, or is it the intent that if a bulk solution were considered to be the superior one, that the TO would then still go forward and cost recover that under the CSRA and rate schedule 19?
I think our intent is to recommend the best project, the most cost-effective project, the most appropriate project. And I think we're going to leave it to the commission to decide the path forward from there. So certainly for a bulk project, if the commission saw that the best path forward was to trigger a public policy need through the NISO's process or a priority transmission project, I think we would leave it to them to make that determination.
All right, thanks. And Liz, I don't want to put you on the spot, but it seemed that the CSRA was presented as something for local projects as opposed to bulk projects, and so just if you have any thoughts on that as well.
It's not something I'm really prepared to talk about, Glenn.
Okay.
We haven't proposed any changes to the current public policy cost recovery mechanisms, for order 1000 bulk projects. That's about all I can say.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
At least I have my hand raised if possible to, I had actually Glenn's question on the PPTN, but with the response, I do want to make a comment that I think it's important to give those questions a strong consideration because the timing will be very important. From my standpoint, representing EDF renewables, we are agnostic to the solution, local, bulk, but the timing is very important because we don't want to be at the end of a 2-year process, the CGPP process, and determine that the bulk solution is more promising and that triggers like the New York ISO or another process. So, like delay in identifying, approving, and, having that upgrade in place. I think the timing is very important. And is there I think we need to give this a strong thought. Do we need to have like a public policy need declared in certain areas in parallel to this process, such that at the end of the process, you have different solutions that can be considered? Or is there a different approach such that there is not a wasting time? Because, you may be in a situation where there might be like 5 years wasted on studies, and that transmission upgrade may be required, badly needed by that time.
So we agree timing is important. The NISO conducts its public policy solicitations on a 2-year cycle, and I think that will continue. So there will be every 2 years the opportunity that stakeholders have today to introduce proposed public policy transmission needs. That will continue. We think we want to leverage the CGPP as an additional tool to look out ahead and identify potential bulk solutions. So we actually think that this will help move things along rather than delay.
Thank you. That would be great if things play out this way. I think I'm looking forward to other comments or
what the commission doesn't have today is a holistic and coordinated view of system needs, and so we do public policy transmission needs kind of in an ad hoc manner. We're trying to organize the planning so that we make public policy transmission need determinations on the basis of, as I said, a more holistic view of emerging system needs.
That would be great. I think historically there has been a reluctance in declaring public policy needs, and now we have the areas of concern. Hopefully we'll see solutions approved soon for those areas of concern, but I think no one wants to be in this situation again where we have areas of concern because of a more proactive planning.
Totally agree. There's a certain amount of inefficiency and catch up that we fell into that resulted in the areas of concern, and we're hoping that implementing a more coordinated, forward-looking process will help eliminate the need for those kinds of ad hoc solutions.
Thank you.
Okay, Jeff.
Okay, so what we've done through these kind of first 3 steps here is we've developed a portfolio of potential projects. So how do we know that these projects are needed? And what we're going to do is kind of the final step of analysis here in the CGPP is a least cost planning assessment. So this stage, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the capacity expansion models that we started the process with. And we're going to use those capacity expansion models to integrate the headroom benefits and the cost of the proposed projects into those zonal models. The goal here is to rerun the capacity expansion model, respecting the headroom limitations on the generation that can connect in each zone. Right, so we're going to put a new limitation onto this capacity expansion model. And what we would expect is the build out would change because of these new limitations on the that were introduced. But the model will also be given the ability to add energy and capacity headroom from our projects. But of course, those projects come at a cost. So the model will be run to make the decision on whether it should change the generation build out. And really, it's focused on evaluating if the cost of adding headroom is less than the cost to move generation to less cost-effective locations. The model could then help us understand then that those projects help reduce the overall cost of achieving the goals. The projects that are shown to help reduce the overall cost of achieving the goals would be proposed as a portfolio of solutions in the final report. So I know that there's kind of a lot here in this stage of the process. I think this is the area where the utilities are focusing on right now in order to build out what this process will look like. But at the higher level, this is how we expect to be able to identify which projects are cost effective and help the state meet the goal of a least cost planning or least cost build out of the transmission and generation systems.
So Jeff, it's Liz, and I agree. There's a lot packed in to this slide. I think we have already a question from Chris Casey, who has a hand up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, coming in. Mm-hmm.
So two questions. One, could you help me understand how non-wires alternatives will be evaluated? Like, to what extent can they be kind of evaluated within the model, or do they need to be screened for afterwards? And then, is it the expectation that this modeling exercise and this least cost planning assessment will be able to establish, what is more or less an avoided cost for grid infrastructure?
So I think the overall goal is, an integrated resource plan, right? So what's the most cost-effective way to achieve the state goals? Is that more generation? Is that more transmission? Probably not either of those. We think it's probably a mix of transmission and generation. So it's all about identifying which combination of generation and transmission will help facilitate the least cost build out to achieve the goals. Now, I think the way we're envisioning this right now is that the non-wires alternatives would be evaluated in the previous steps. So we would consider non-wires in the same vein that we would consider bulk transmission or local transmission or advanced technology. And we're looking for the most cost-effective solution to address the needs. And if the non-wires alternative, whatever that may be, it turns out to be the most cost-effective project at addressing the need, then that project and that project's benefit and that project's cost would be given to these models here at this least cost planning stage. And the model would run through and say, okay, yes, this project, and again, whatever that project might be, it could be non-wires or transmission or advanced technology, whatever that project is, the model will help us understand if the headroom that project creates helps lower the cost of achieving the state goals.
Chris, does that make sense?
I think so. And I guess, so at the end of the day, though, it does sound like this least cost assessment will provide what is, it'll both identify solutions, but also create what is in essence, the establish an avoided cost of grid upgrades needed to increase the headroom to integrate the renewables. And so maybe that's not a full picture of all kind of system upgrade, all costs associated with system upgrades, because there might be some that are different than just those driving increased headroom, but or am I still a little confused?
It's Liz. I'm not sure that I understand the question, so I'll punt to you, Jeff.
I think we are looking for the total cost. I think our intent is to not miss anything. We're trying to understand, again, if it's generation, and maybe generation includes storage, or maybe generation is renewables or offshore, or the NISO is my new favorite term, DFERS, right? So whatever it is, if there is a cost to avoid some generation by more effectively using the generation that we may already have, or using less generation because we've put transmission in place, right? The transmission helps us more effectively use the generation and may reduce the total amount of generation we would need. That would be a savings, right? So we want to make sure that the savings associated with, for example, reducing the amount of generation that we need is more than the cost of the transmission solutions, right? We may have a fantastic transmission solution, but if it's very, very expensive and the program says, I can build generation in a more expensive zone and still the overall cost is less than it would have been with the transmission, then the program would say, look, we don't want that transmission solution. It just doesn't make sense.
Let me give one more. Let me give a specific example to see if it's helpful. So would, for instance, the identification of what is least cost provide and avoided costs that could be kind of slid into the beater value stack, for example, to represent a particular DER's contribution to helping facilitate headroom or on the system, or would or not, and would this process only be applicable to DERs to the extent that they are one of the part of a non-wires alternative that was evaluated throughout the process. Okay, I'm trying to figure out if this planning process and the quantitative analysis in particular is going to provide information that will be helpful in some of the other processes that we do.
I'm not real well versed in the DER side. I think at this point we weren't thinking of the value stack the way you're characterizing it. I think we were thinking more of DER is a generation tool. So if the program saw opportunities to build DER, build that generation, and that generation was cheaper than a transmission solution, for example, then that's the way the program would expand the generation profile. So we would maybe say, well, we need more than 10,000 megawatts of DER, for example. Maybe that would be one outcome of the model, is it would show the need for expanding the amount of DER. But I don't think the value stack, the way you characterize it, would be something that would come out of this model.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
think I saw Erin raise a hand. Erin, did you have something?
I think Radhika was ahead of me.
Oh.
Sorry, I don't want to jump the line.
Radhika, did we?
Sorry, go ahead, Erin. I had my hand raised from previously. No question.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay. So, you know, I'm just trying to think through how this will work. It sounds like it could work, but so I just want to verbalize it while I have you here to see if I'm missing something. You're going to go back to the resource expansion model, the capacity model, that is a bubble and pipe zonal, right?
Yes.
Use load duration. I don't think it's sequential, but I think Justin's on, maybe they did it sequential 8760, or they only picked it. No, I take that back. I'm almost certain they only take snapshots in time to evaluate the resource expansion model, but it's done so sequentially. And if we could have Jason, I'm sorry, not Justin, Jason confirm that could help inform the next set of questions.
Yes, I mean, I can say that I know that the NISO's model uses time slices. I think there were 17 time slices that they used in their capacity expansion model, if that helps.
Yeah, that's right, Jeff.
Okay.
Their time slice is not sequential.
Okay. So now I'm thinking the resource adequacy model is a bubble. You have intra lines that will be added. You have load within your power flow that will be assessed, and then double checking that the headroom for exporting out of an area is sufficient. That if there's enough headroom, then you're saying it's least cost. And if you could just clarify that, if you could walk me through those steps again on how you do that headroom calculation.
Sure. So there is a methodology out there, and the utilities have filed, I think, 2 times now, our headroom calculations. So the headroom calculations are, I mean, there's a bunch of technical details in there, but essentially we look at some power flow cases, we make some generation assumptions, and then we see, okay, based on these assumptions, how much more generation could we pack into this local area? And what we can do is we can step back from that and we can say, okay, National Grid has, 2 pockets in Zone C, and Avangrid has 3 pockets, generation pockets within Zone C. And we can say, okay, between both companies or between all the companies in Zone C, here's the total amount of headroom we have on the local system. So this, though, is the local system. So as you characterized it, right, there are still bulk limitations. If I said, for example, that there was 5,000 megawatts of local headroom, which, I mean, that's just a number I picked out of the air that's very large. If there was 5,000 megawatts of local headroom, but only 2,000 megawatts of capability to push power from Zone C to the other zones around it, well, that 5,000 megawatts of local headroom could never be used. It would never be useful because the bulk system would prevent us from being able to site that much generation within that bubble. So these headroom numbers are kind of just one of the constraints on the bubbles. So you may remember that there's also, like the Climate Action Council did some work where the Climate Action Council considered what could be built, what is physically capable of being built within each zone. So they might have said, well, this much wind or this much, solar could be built within this zone. So that was one constraint on the model. These headroom numbers will be another constraint on the model. The size of the pipes, right, that connect each bubble would be another constraint on the model. So the model will consider all of these constraints, and sometimes the local headroom would be limiting and sometimes it wouldn't. And if the local headroom is not limiting, then that would tell us that additional projects within that bubble may not make sense.
Okay. And now that, thank you, that makes sense. How does the power flow max flow match up to the time slices? Because the power flow isn't an 8760 flow, is it? Or is it just a snapshot in time across the year?
Yes, that's right. So the power flow models are a snapshot. They're an attempt to bookend system performance. So we're trying to look at conditions that we think are representative of the 8760 or the 17 time slices, however you want to think about it. So we may have, for example, 3 or 4 different time or power flow models for each year, for example, and they may represent different load conditions or different generation conditions, and those are attempting to bookend system performance for the other hours.
Okay. But just the one other question, and thank you, that was helpful. The other question I think, or maybe I'll just highlight, the least cost reference, I'm not sure it's definitively the least cost, because you're taking the resource expansion model, putting it into your system, but in doing your power flows in this stage 2 and doing all your assessment, but are you looking, and if you said this, I apologize, are you looking at alternatives within your area to see, for example, if you got generation sited closer to load, that it actually might need less? So if you put things closer to Albany, Syracuse, Buffalo, that it potentially could use less transmission? Are you doing that type of an assessment?
Yes, and that is especially relevant in the capacity expansion model, right? So the capacity expansion model would help us understand, like maybe you could site generation in Poughkeepsie, but maybe it's 10 times more expensive to do so, just making something up. So the capacity expansion model is already trying to consider where the most economic location is to build the generation. And then we're kind of using our power flow analysis to show, okay, as we drill down into the zone, we're giving information about headroom to try to guide generators even within the zone to more efficient locations. So kind of at all different levels, we're looking for those most efficient places to build the generation. And when a limitation is imposed on the model, like, for example, there is no local headroom, that's when the model would be forced to build in a more expensive area for generation.
And I'll just point out, Aaron, what may or may not be obvious, but NYSERDA is a key partner and stakeholder and keenly interested party in the process and its outcomes, and we'll be working with them to do what we can as we move into the future to try to encourage generators to move into those more efficient spots on the system.
That's helpful, Liz. I guess that's where, the headroom, when you put it all together, and, back to Jeff's point, at that final stage, the resource expansion model might decide, if I understand this correctly, might decide because of cost constraints to build solar in the lower Hudson Valley as opposed to out west. And that's your expectation, that you think that final step would double check to see if you folks put things out in the western part, if you still get the same generation mix that was originally given to you from, say, the NYSO's modeling.
That's right. We're looking to see if the transmission can help facilitate that least cost generation placement. Right. That's right.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. And thank you for taking the time to explain that. I appreciate it.
Sure. Are there other questions, or should we go to the next slide?
It was I just question, but good.
Okay.
Yes, and Jeff, maybe I should have asked this question earlier, but there's non-incumbent transmission owners that now have non-bulk assets as well. How are their assets going to be evaluated in correlation with the incumbent TO's assets?
So I think the way we're viewing this is again, there may be kind of initially a lead transmission owner considering the pockets. So if the majority of the equipment in the area is owned by one transmission owner, they would work as the primary doing the studies, but they would coordinate with others. And if that other party is a non-incumbent transmission owner, they would be having those conversations through the development of the alternatives.
Okay, thanks.
This is Corinne DiDomenico. I had a question as well.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
It's back on the last slide as well, sort of tied into this. We didn't touch on it yet, but for the bulk alternatives that are going to be compared, how are those alternatives developed to be compared in the solution? And will there be an opportunity for other market participants to submit any?
Let me jump in before Jeff and just remind everybody that if there are Order 1000 type bulk solutions recommended, or the possibility of a need for an Order 1000 bulk solution, the commission will refer that to the NISO just per the existing processes, and the NISO will solicit solutions the same way they do today.
Oh yes, just in the screening process that was discussed. I guess I didn't see it as a formal solicitation, but maybe that's up to, I guess maybe just the first question is, it looks like there will be a bulk alternative that will be compared, and I'm wondering how that bulk alternative will be developed.
Yep, so we're expecting at this point to do potentially several different things. So the utilities may create generic kind of projects that we think would address the need. And those could be compared against the other projects being considered to see if they at a high level that they are, providing the same benefits or are competitive in terms of how efficiently they're providing those benefits. We also expect to use a consultant. So we will be leveraging some consultant support to see if they can help develop any alternative bulk solutions that could satisfy the need. That's initially where we think we're going to start. CGPP is a living process. And as we go through each cycle of CGPP, we would take lessons learned and look for opportunities to improve the process. And this may be one area where there could be some improvement. This is also one area where we would be interested in hearing stakeholder feedback about if there was an opportunity to provide feedback, what would that look like? The timelines, of course, are very, very tight. So the original goal with using a consultant was to try to maintain the timeline for the entire end-to-end process. So how would developers participate? How would they provide timely feedback? Is there interest there? I think that is something we'd be interested to hear from stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. Like how to carry out this step. I think we are looking for input. I can say that we have, asked the NISO whether over time, providing some kind of a screen of the sort that Jeff is describing is a function that they might appropriately provide in their role as the independent transmission planner. So there are probably some different ways to do this, and we're interested in people's thoughts.
From the phone?
Yes, phone.
Yeah. Hey, question.
Can
Jeff,
you identify yourself? Can you identify yourself?
Yeah, Joe Rosignoli for Connect, yeah?
I see you. Okay. Yep.
Thank you. Jeff, thanks for the presentation. Just had a question that is a similar but different from this last one. How will NWAs be solicited from the market within the CGPP so that the most cost-effective solution could be plugged into this least cost planning process across, the entire field of potential solutions? And what would the timing be on that so that, thoughtful solutions could be provided into the process? Not bulk, but within CGPP.
The way we envision it working is that when we're developing our alternatives, we would consider non-wires alternatives. So there would be a screening process to see if non-wires were viable. And, this would include, we hope, some feedback from the Advanced Technology Working Group for how to consider these types of things that are non-traditional, kind of what, not wires. So we're hoping to put these guidelines in place that would help us determine if non-wires are viable or cost effective. And then we would carry those alternatives through the process. And then when we reached here, the least cost planning assessment, if that non-wires alternative is recommended to move forward, right? It's identified as a necessary project or a cost-effective project. Then it would be up to the transmission owners to implement that project. So again, whether that project is wires or non-wires or advanced technology, whatever it is, that project would be picked up from this process and developed by the utility. So if that includes, for example, soliciting non-wires alternatives from developers, that project would continue once this process wraps up.
So looking at the your R&D report timeline filed by the joint utilities for that process you just outlined, you're confident that cost-effective, reliable solutions, technically sound solutions, would be scouted and screened and assessed and be in place in time to plug into this CGPP phase that's on the screen right now, this slide, that
yes.
You feel that that's going to come together?
Yeah, that's our intent, yes.
Okay, and then the third bullet on that slide, trading off energy and capacity headroom equal to the cost of the local T&D project. What you really mean there then is the local T&D projects or any other project that came through the pipeline we were just discussing. Is that right?
Yeah, apologies, because that's a good catch, because you're absolutely right. It's not necessarily T&D projects that would be evaluated in that step. It would be any project. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Okay, thank you.
This is another area, though, Joe, and I may have said this before, where, what are the mechanics of providing an entry point for alternate technology solutions? And if you have thoughts about that, including thoughts about, what kind of process or timing is needed to get good proposals on the table, please consider giving us comments on that.
I will. Thanks, Liz. This isn't the R&D technical conference, but there's a lot of NWAs out there that are technically sound that really don't need to be. They're in use and they don't need to be scouted and screened. And I just worry that 2023 is going to run out of time. But we can provide more specific comment on that. Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Yes, hi, Elizabeth. This is Randy Singh from Olstead. I've got a question as well. Actually, two questions. One is, I suppose I'm trying to understand, and maybe this was covered the 2 minutes that I joined late, as to what type of problems are we looking to solve here? That's one. And are they very specific problems, or are they all just linked to the CLCPA? And then I guess my second question is, I'm sure everyone is aware that there's a meshed grid type solution proposed by NYSERDA out there, and how does that kind of relate into this this process?
Right. So this planning process that we're building is focused on the investment needed to meet CLCPA targets. That of course includes our offshore wind targets. So that's the purpose of the exercise. And as far as the mesh is still not nice. As I understand it, NYSERDA is still studying the mesh option. So there isn't too much we can say about it at this point, except that if the commission, if all the relevant parties decide that we should go in the direction of the mesh, that will be part of the planning. I think does that help answer your question?
Sure, I think so for the second part, but for the first part, in terms of what kind of projects, the initial sort of PPTN, there was some very concrete objectives as to what that that PPTN
Correct.
wanted to achieve. Is that the same that is going to be expected here at all?
The utilities are charged with figuring out what grid upgrades are needed to meet CLCPA, and if in the appropriate case, the state commission will take advantage of the NYSO process to do further solicitations in appropriate cases, but other types of investment will proceed in other ways.
Understood. So this in fact is actually a very broad sort of.
Yes.
Okay, so it's not targeted like the other PPTN was.
This is not a PPTN.
I mean, it's just a proposal. Yes, sorry.
This is the proposal for a state integrated planning process.
Understood. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Sure. Okay. Go on.
Hey, Liz, Chris, just one other clarifying question.
Yep.
We're talking about a couple-year process, and Jeff, I'm assuming that LIPA and NYPA are also involved in this, since many of the areas that they have jurisdiction over could be pockets of curtailments that could affect meeting CLCPA?
Yes, yep, they're all involved, correct.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, I think we should move on. We'll try to have time for any, trailing questions when we get to the end, but let's try to let Jeff finish his presentation.
Okay, so with the last step, the least cost planning assessment complete, that essentially completes all of the technical analysis that would be done. And the final step here is the preparation of a report. And the report will provide accurate and actionable information to the commission, market participants, policymakers, and other stakeholders. Right, so that's the goal, is to put together this report. The report will identify and rank portfolios of solutions needed to ensure the timely and cost-effective attainment of CLCPA, right? That's important. We're going to identify and rank solutions. The report will also identify bulk system needs. And again, this is the area where we see the commission will follow up and decide whether or not they should identify a need through the NYSO's public policy transmission process or in the NYPA priority transmission process. That would be the action for the commission to consider. Comment period would be available for stakeholders to comment on the final report. And then once comments have been considered, we expect the PSC may issue one or more orders. And that would conclude that cycle of CGPP.
Hey, Jeff, it's Kevin. A question on that, the ranking piece of it. Is that a ranking per utility or a ranking of all of the solutions?
Yes, it's a ranking of the portfolio of projects across everyone. Yes.
But earlier, I mean, everything was being done on an individual utility basis. So I guess I'm confused, like how you would rank a project, for example, in Rockland County against a project in Wyoming County.
Yeah, but that's where the least cost planning work will come in, right? So it will show us which projects were selected by the model. It'll help us understand why, and it'll help us understand which projects were more effective at helping develop that least cost generation build out. And really, when you do that, you really have to look statewide, right? So, a good example might be like within Zone C. Let's go back to that example from earlier. And if National Grid has projects and Avangrid has projects, the model would help us understand which projects were selected or which projects were more effective at creating headroom that was used by the model. So we would be able to say, okay, these projects appear to be more important or more efficient at helping the state meet the goal, and that's how we would intend to perform a ranking of solutions.
Okay, but I mean, I get that if you have projects that are in the same area, but if you have projects that are addressing very different needs in very different parts of the state, I'm confused as to how that gets ranked. And also, I mean, I think this is where input, other types of input that I haven't heard you talk about yet, I think are going to be critical. What I mean by that is you guys can identify, okay, well, project A will provide more headroom than project B, but those projects might be in an area where it doesn't make sense to site generation and the headroom isn't really needed. So getting input from developers or looking at information the way the NISO does to understand where the areas are that are the best areas, whether it's wind, whether it's solar or hydro or any other type of generation resource, is going to be equally as critical. But I'm not clear on how that gets factored in here. It's not, I guess my concern is it can't just be a unilateral decision by the utilities, because there's a lot of other players out here that have very critical information that should factor into this ranking and this analysis.
So we do view the stakeholder process, especially in the early stages of CGPP, where we identify the scenarios and the build out. That's a very important step during that process. We'll be figuring out where the generation is going, where it's interested in going, where it's cost effective to go. So that would be a consideration. And when we initially develop our scenarios for use in the entire process end to end, would be that kind of stakeholder input at the beginning.
Okay, but then how do you deal with when you have different needs?
So there, I think the example I would give would be, if you built more offshore wind, you would need less land-based resources, perhaps. Right? If it was cost effective to build 30 gigawatts of offshore wind, you would certainly expect that there would be much less need for land-based wind or utility scale solar. So the model will be playing off of those too. So there may be shifts between upstate or downstate, or shifts between the western part of the state and the eastern part of the state. So the model would still show us which projects are providing those beneficial increases in headroom. And I still think we would, again, this is a developing process, and I'm not saying that we will do it perfectly correct the first time, or even that we've worked out all of the details for how we will perform this ranking, but we do believe that the model will help us understand which projects are beneficial regardless of where they are.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, not taking your example of onshore versus offshore, but let's say we know that there are two areas in New York that are very conducive for onshore wind. One is the North Country, the other is the Southern Tier. We also know that there are transmission needs in both areas. So I guess I'm trying to understand why the utilities would be the ones to pick to say, well, we'd rather build transmission in the Southern Tier over the North Country, which would then skew the development of onshore wind to the Southern Tier, when there could be some very attractive onshore wind projects in the North Country, and it might actually make sense to go forward with both projects.
Could I jump in here, Kevin? This is Idemir from Con Edison.
Yeah.
I think what Jeff is trying to convey is that there's going to be some scenario analysis here, because none of us really understand the future or or able to predict the future. So by examining those possible futures, we can look at and compare portfolios, these statewide portfolios among those different possible futures. And the idea is to inform stakeholders at DPS and the decision makers, all stakeholders, on what might be the best course of action, best investments. It's not to suggest that utilities would be selecting a solution set.
But that's the best course from your perspective of a T&D build out. That may not be the best course from generation potential.
But the idea is to look at, the whole idea is what transmission can I build to minimize generation costs? So we're looking at the two together, that it's in an integrated planning approach.
And Kevin, we agree it's very difficult.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there, Liz.
Kevin, and that's why even in the system resource outlook, and Jason, it's nothing to discredit your study, you did a great job, but these modeling tools do have their limitations. And the resource expansion model will have the cost of the generation, and they will have more accurate, well, they'll have transmission cost, and then they'll rerun the system, they'll rerun the Plexos, I guess is the model that they're using, the resource expansion, and see if the generation mix still based on those costs for the transmission are, if the generation would still want to be built. So specifically for within a county, they're not going to be that specific. But if it's with Zone D in the North Country or Zone E or even offshore wind, if you get a significant difference, then you potentially see that it was more cost effective to put it closer. But within a specific region, I don't think they'll be able to really do that. And it would come up to their judgment call, I think. I do have concerns with the characterization that it's least cost, because all these models and all these are judgments. It's your best estimate, pretty much, or probable cost. So, so I think those are some of my observations and concerns. I thought that might help you a bit.
Thanks, Erin. You know, from DPS perspective, we are hoping that people like you, Kevin, Erin, others, you know, will help us solve this very difficult problem. How best do we, what's the best way to look at future generation build out? And this is the proposal the TOs, the JU have come up with. And if there are other ways to do it and get the commission, you know, as I said, a coordinated overview of the most efficient way to achieve, you know, to build transmission in support of CLCPA objectives, you know, by all means, help us here. This is a very, very difficult problem to solve. Erin, you have something else? No?
Yeah, Liz, fully acknowledge that, and just to be clear, I mean, I'm not knocking the TOs have clearly put a lot of thought and effort into this, and appreciate that. I'm still in the phase of just trying to understand how the pieces move together. But you know, we'll certainly look through it and provide some comments to the agency on it. But I mean, I think my sense is the utilities have spent a tremendous amount of time thinking through these pieces, and we're also sort of in an all new world here, and this is new stuff for all of us.
Yep. In some ways it is. I've had, you know, some engineers who say, oh my God, here comes integrated resource planning again. You know, but I agree. We are certainly, we are doing something new here. And I think our presenter, I think Jeff said, you know, the first round there will be some learning in the first round. But we really appreciate all inputs you can give. We think it's critical for, you know, these are critical objectives for the state. And so your help in, you know, guiding us in the right direction is will be very much appreciated. Randy, do you have something?
Yes, hi, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
I had a question regarding data access. I know there are certain sort of difficulties in getting, say, modeling data, and sometimes probably more appropriately like one lines and things like that. Is there, in order to propose solutions, developers and I guess other TOs will also need to have access to this type of stuff. And I don't think there's a mechanism for us to get that unless you're a NISO participant or a generation developer. But then even then you can get like modeling cases, but you can't get like station one lines unless you propose something at a particular station, and even that is at the discretion of the TO. So it kind of makes it pretty difficult to be able to devise a project. So is there any sort of advice or guidance you have for that?
I'd ask the utilities first to respond. Jeff, or if you can.
You know,
How do you handle non-wires alternative, you know, data access for NWAs now? Uh-oh, we might have stumped the professor.
Do we lose him?
We may not be the right utility representatives to answer that. We can take it back and get back to you, Liz.
Okay, I mean, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure that you do have some protocols in place to the extent that you have been implementing NWAs. But Randy, that is something, you know. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say, Elizabeth, that is, I mean, in our experience as developers, it's extremely difficult to get hands on that. So any solution that we come up with is going to be extremely high level as compared to a incumbent TO, and when compared to a developer. And so it's going to be, because we don't have access to that type of data. Modeling data, like, you know, power flow cases, yes, the NISO is open to that as long as you have the CEII and the appropriate access. But when it comes to specific engineering type data, like comes to like one lines, what's available at a substation, what kind of positions are there, we do not have access to that. And until we file something, we won't get access to it. And even then, it's a limited, small little sliver that we get to see, and it's next to impossible for us to devise anything with that sort of information.
I'm seeing a message that Jeff got knocked off his computer and is rebooting. Randy, I can't answer those questions in detail. It's certainly a relevant topic for comment, since we're trying to integrate advanced technologies into this process. And as I said, I think the TOs have existing protocols, but as you say, they may be quite difficult to work with. Do we have other hands up, or Jeff is rebooting? Okay, Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think I've unmuted twice now. So, yeah, you know, Liz, I think process is inevitable that we'll have to talk about it. So maybe we could use the opportunity. I believe one of the earlier signs that said something about the utilities are taking comments until sometime, I think December 21st, and we'll be filing the plan in January. And I guess, like, you know, I suggested that the BCA be conducted on the range.
Whoa.
So I highlighted, you know, the suggestion that the BCA could be done on the range of the +50 -25%. And I'm, you know, just wondering, will they take that back, or is that something more that we have to formally put in writing?
Oh, well, let me tell you what our expectations are. Our expectations are that the utility, the folks who are building this, you know, the filers, the filing parties are listening to what you're saying, and that they are taking back, you know, the questions and comments here, and that if they choose to do so, they will integrate the comments and suggestions that they agree with in their revised filing. Since, of course, they may not agree with everything or take note of all the comments you've made, or since you may have other comments on the revision, I think staff is going to have to take steps a bit later this year to extend the comment period beyond January, so that people still have the opportunity to submit written comments on the revised filing before the commission looks at it. Does that help?
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Liz, this is Mike Mager. I guess I just wanted to very quickly express some support for Erin's suggestion. I think, we're dealing with proposals that, collectively, and maybe even individually, are hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. And if they're going to be evaluated with only an estimate with a plus 50, minus 25 range, then I really think the commission needs to assume the worst and rely on the plus 50%, because I just, it's kind of inconceivable that we would be approving projects costing billions of dollars with a plus 50% potential exposure, and that might result in a lot of projects moving forward that really shouldn't be moving forward. So just wanted to support Erin's suggestion.
Yeah, to the extent we ever sleep again, it will be because we've solved that problem.
Yeah, let's hope we are. I would ask the utilities in the filed plan that they clarify exactly what that 50% means. So, for example, Jeff characterized the projects that are accelerated would have a higher cost than those that could spend more time developing and not have to accelerate it so quickly. And that makes perfect sense. But in my mind, I'm assuming that's the baseline that the plus 50 minus 25 is taken from. And so to the extent you folks put in your plan this range, which is obviously appropriate, I think it would also be appropriate to put in the plan and describe how that range is interpreted and what it really means. Is it the uncertainty of cost? Is it the timeline and things along those lines?
Erin, I've heard the utilities explain, how and why they use that kind of bandwidth. And I think they can probably provide that.
Yeah, and that's great. Just putting it in writing would really help. Okay. Thank you.
It's for them to, yeah, they're welcome. Exactly. If it's of concern, I hope they will think about that and provide as much, as much explanation for, the limitations on their cost estimating that they can. But it's not a new issue, right?
No, of course not. And I'm not saying it's a limitation, and it's really more just so we understand how they're interpreting their base estimate and what the increment 50% or minus 25% would potentially reflect.
Yeah, I think, from what I've heard, and I'm obviously not speaking for the utilities here, but from what I've heard, a lot of the uncertainty in the estimating has to do with what what one of the participants, mentioned earlier, which is the timeline from, development and proposal to construction in the transmission universe is very long, as we all know.
Understood. So thank you.
Yep. Jeff, did you have anything else? Or are you wrapped up?
Yes, that was my final slide.
Okay. So we have additional time on the calendar if we haven't addressed everybody's questions or anybody has some follow-up. We have a open Q&A.
Hey Liz, this is Zach with Nice to you.
Hey Zach.
Sorry, I'm getting feedback. Give me 1 second. I'll just point out there is a participant list, Liz, where you can see everyone who has raised their hands. So in the future, you might check that out and call out those hand raises. So a question on process. So sorry, I know I've asked this a couple times for the scene.
Uh-oh, you're dropping out. Hey, Zach, I think we lost you. I think we lost Zach.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. We're expecting a revised filing from the JU on January 1st, taking all this feedback into account.
Taking whatever feedback into account that they think is relevant and helpful. Yes.
And so I know you've mentioned a couple times that the comment deadline is going to be pushed, but I've also seen it on the last few slides as December 21st. So we won't be expected to file comments before the JU puts forth another proposal. Is that right?
No, you absolutely don't have to file comments if there's something about the pending proposal that you really want to zero in on, and you're absolutely welcome to file comments, but you know, we know there's going to be a revision, so it makes sense to extend the comment period, and that we expect most people will comment after January 1st.
Okay, that'll be something like a 60-day period.
I don't know yet, but we'll come up with something.
At least 30 days. Just trying to plan.
At least 30 days.
Okay, all right, sounds good.
People should, you know, be reading the proposal and thinking about areas that they might want to comment on and getting ready so that we don't have to spend 6 months, you know, another 6 months. You know, that would be unfortunate.
Yeah, and I think we all want this to move as quickly as possible, but I might suggest, you know, more like a 60-day, because like you said, we got to dig into this new proposal starting January 1st. So we'll need some time to digest and kick around. And that speaks to the data access point, and I guess I just wanted to reiterate, you know, how difficult it is for us to intelligently propose solutions without the same access to data. And so incorporating some sort of data sharing protocol as early as possible certainly seems to make a lot of sense. And then I don't know if this speaks to that at all, but has there been any talk or consideration about some third-party element, some, you know, international grid planning firm that might act as a third-party planner here, and, you know, give them access to the utility data as a kind of firewall if you know, it turns out that cybersecurity or, you know, customer information is a concern with data sharing.
But for what purpose, Zach?
Well, so, you know, what we're talking about right now is helping the utilities come up with a grid plan here and getting stakeholder feedback. But it's tough to get external non-utility, if you will, stakeholder feedback without utility data. So looking for some way to bring external expertise, you know, another opinion other than the utilities into this equation, assuming that, you know, data sharing is going to continue to be an issue and concern.
Well, I'll just say from experience, data sharing at that level and that scale is extremely complicated. So that would be a very, very high hurdle. Of course, any market participant or group of market participants is welcome to reach out for consulting help to understand the databases and you know, the data that the utilities are using and the outputs of the process. You know, you guys are always free to do that. We are hoping to call on the NISO to fill some of that role with respect to some of the analyses that will be coming out of the utilities work. You know, as an independent, you know, third-party planner with access to all the relevant databases. It's not currently on the table, but if there's some role, specific role that you think we ought to farm out to some third party, we certainly would consider it, and you should, make that a topic of your comment.
Yeah, so I guess more directly, I wonder from the utilities if there has been any talk or consideration of hiring a consultant to help with this work.
Yeah, we certainly do expect to have some consultant support, building cases and performing some of the screening analysis. In order to maintain the timeline we've proposed, we do expect to need a consultant to support us.
Okay.
This is Deirdre from Con Ed. I guess the ultimate goal to just to be clear and make sure everyone's on the same page. The ultimate goal is in the long run that we would hope to have NISO perform some of the work that's necessary in terms of looking at the interactions, say, across utility regions and things like that. But we also understand that right now they themselves are strapped with resource constraints. So for this first CGPP, we're probably looking to lean on some consultants some more. But for this whole CGPP process to work going forward, I think our expectation is we're trying as best we could to and efficiently as we can to try to employ NISO where it seems fit. All right, but that's the long-term goal.
Idra, does the NISO have the access to all the local details like they do for the bulk?
The individual utilities will be looking at our own local systems, and then I think ultimately our expectation is NISO is going to pull it together and look at how and if our local projects have an impact on our neighboring systems or at the bulk level.
So they wouldn't be doing any analysis of your local projects. They would just be taking whatever you give them for them.
They're looking, well, for we currently today, each of the utilities does an analysis on its own local system, right? And we provide information about our local system and our local projects to the NISO. And we plan to utilize that sort of mechanism in the CGPP.
I think what's maybe different, Kevin, is the idea that, that we would add to, we're thinking about adding to what the NISO does, some kind of cross utility examination of the local plans, rather than the NISO. I can't speak for them, but when they look at LTPs now, they're just looking at utility by utility, I think. And what we may need to do to make sure that the plan is coordinated is to ask the NISO to do a similar, and we talked about this before, to do some kind of a reality check. Are we missing something, impact between regions or impact to the bulk? That would be a good role for them to take on.
Yeah, I'm curious. I see that Zach and Yachi Lin are on. Whether the NISO, do they have the capacity to even do that broader analysis given what they're doing now with their own planning work?
So they've been really clear with us, and I'll step down if they want to answer the question directly, but they've been really clear with us that certainly not in the short run. They're resource constrained as far as taking on new tasks like that for the first round of CGPP. And that's why you heard Deirdre and Jeff talking about getting a consultant.
Gotcha.
Yeah, hey Liz, hey Kevin, this is Zach. Good question and good discussion here today. Yeah, to something that Deirdre touched upon, and as you were just describing, certainly we are resource constrained right now, but hopefully that's a near-term issue. And really what I think we need to be thinking about is thinking about NISO's mission, what our role is, and how that informs what our involvement would be in this overall CGPP process. And I think a lot of good ideas have come up today listening to this tech conference, and gets to some of the thoughts that we've had in terms of our involvement. There are areas that are very easily within our expertise, within our wheelhouse, that I think are almost no-brainers in terms of our engagement. And then there are other areas which are a little more sensitive, and part of that is the consideration of bulk solutions, alternative bulk solutions relative to local. And we're interested in finding the best way through that. For example, in our current processes, we actually have an obligation to look at local plans, not only within a single service territory, but as they relate to each other, and to think about them relative to bulk needs. The twist on that is that under our current tariff, under our current procedures, that only happens if we have a bulk need to begin with. So it's something for us to consider now with this new process with CGPP is, well, what actions would we be able to take if there is not a need declared yet? And what role does that put us in trying to understand the implications on the bulk system? And we're still thinking that through. But I think I can tell you I've heard a lot of interesting thoughts on this tech conference here today, and NISO welcomes any further feedback from NISO stakeholders regarding what our role should be in this process.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. I appreciate this. I mean, I think today was a very good conversation as well. Just wanted to understand what your guys' perspective was.
Yep, very, very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. I'm glad you guys are able to listen in. Any other, before we wrap?
Liz, this is Erin. Just one quick question. And maybe this falls under the umbrella of the ISO's involvement. When or if do we just identify impacts perhaps to neighboring areas? We have PJM, we potentially are putting a lot of units out in the Western New York, and I'm just curious, is that going to be a consideration to make sure it all kind of fits together? Not perfectly, because I realize it wouldn't happen until the final interconnection process, but at the same time, is there some preliminary screening and what considerations are made to our neighboring regions?
Erin, from a very parochial perspective, this exercise focuses on what New York needs to meet New York's goals. The NISO has a role in looking at system impact, neighboring system impacts. Maybe NISO folks have a reaction to that question?
And let me just jump in before you even feel like you're compelled to respond.
Okay.
I absolutely understand this is supposed to be for us to achieve our goals. What I think I'm perhaps a little more concerned about, if we come up with an idea or a proposal for a transmission, and lo and behold, at the 11th hour, we find out it has a huge impact to a neighboring region. That could be a problem. And I didn't hear, perhaps that did fall under the screening process that Jeff mentioned earlier. I don't know. But it might be wise that the plan includes some sort of acknowledgement of that step, or somewhere where that ultimately where that impact occurs.
Mm-hmm.
Not that you have to give me the answer today.
Oh, I got it. Jeff, or any of the TOs, do you have a first brush thought about that?
Yeah, as a first pass, I think our screening would have to consider impacts on at least the interfaces with our neighbors. So I think at a high level, we would try to capture if there was, again, kind of a deal breaker, if it has significant degradation to interface capability with our neighbors, that would be, in my mind, a deal breaker for that project. So I think we'll capture that, maybe not in explicit detail, that would be something that would be a follow-up as part of the NISO's interconnection process if necessary. Those, impacts would be identified there as well.
And Jeff, thank you very much. I figured you folks, would consider something like that. The aspect that I'm really hoping for is that kind of detail would be included in your plan that you submit in January. So thank you.
Yeah, and that's perhaps another area where, understanding the coordination between the analyses the TOs are doing here and, the routine analyses that the NISO does with, our other neighboring partners. The answer is probably somewhere in there. Okay. Good conversation. We've been at it 2 hours. Unless there's anything else, I think we can wrap. Again, process-wise, the utilities will take back comments and thoughts and integrate those things that they think are good for the process. And we'll see a revised version by January 1 of 23. And we will, as I said, the staff will make sure we get some additional time for commenters to file written comments on the next iteration. We also will be having one more meeting of the smaller steering committee group just to see if we've missed something or just to get their feedback. And people are, absolutely reach out to me and to my colleagues with any other questions on CGPP. And thanks to everybody for following us and participating on this little stakeholder journey over the last 6 or 7 months. I hope everybody has found it at least informative, and I hope that it helps you to focus on those issues that you really want to give us feedback on. We do appreciate your thoughts, and this is a complex and as somebody said, a new venture. We want to try to get it right. We don't expect to get it 100% right the first time out the gate, but we depend on you to help us try to come close. So with that, thank you again for your participation, and we'll see you at the end of the year. So long.
Thank you, everyone.